Next speaker is Mikaela Erskog from the Tricontinental Institute, where she works as a researcher and editor and coordinates the Tricontinental Pan-Africa office. Mikaela, where are you talking to us from today?
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
I hope you can hear me. All right.
We can hear you, yeah.
Sorry I can't be there. I'm actually on the other side of the planet in China because I'm also doing my PhD at Fudan University in Shanghai. And so, yes, apologies I can't be there in the room, and I'm sorry if I'm a specter that's hovering above the panel. But I hope we will still be able to have a little bit of interaction and dialogue. So what I want to talk about a little bit is about how this moment is being felt in Africa, and also some of the nodes of challengers that are appearing on the continent and in the world in relation to the topic at hand. And we're talking right now, it's been 80 years after the defeat of fascism, and this was a defeat not by what is popularly discussed as the Allied forces in the West, but actually the defeat was largely on the backs of the Soviet Union, China, and colonized people. The Soviet Union lost 27 million people. China lost 23 million people. And this was starting in the 30s. And Africa saw at least 2 million people participate in the war and die in the war, as well as the Asian colonies that. And this has largely been erased in Western memory. And so we find ourselves commemorating this sad anniversary 80 years on, but the world is again confronted by a system of domination that wants to maintain total planetary authority. At Tricontinental, we've named this as a system of hyper-imperialism, where a highly integrated bloc, the global north, centered in the G7 countries, is using military force, sanctions, financial coercion, information warfare to discipline the rest of the world. And this militarization is not a sign of strength, it is a sign of deep crisis, as many of you know. Hegemony is historically lost in 3 stages: in production, finance, and military. The United States has lost hegemony in production. I mean, in the 1990s, the G7 produced about 70% of global GDP. Today, it produces less than 40%. However, it still maintains, hegemony in areas like technology, and particularly military-related technology. And it sees its financial hegemony as being challenged, though this is still in the very early stages, as we know, and it revolves around the status of the US dollar and South-South trade, etc. So even though the economic and political aspects of its decline might be accelerating, we know that the real danger is that it retains military power. And this has created a temptation for the US to attempt to overcome the consequences of its own economic decline by military or through military means. And with China now as the world's largest economy in PPP terms, and Asia and Africa as major poles and nodes of energy, minerals, and labor, and the growth of South-South trade, we see that the US is feeling increasingly threatened by the shifts in the international order. And on top of this, of course, since October 7th, for the last decade, since 2008, we see also that the US increasingly is losing political legitimacy. Most of humanity, which 80% of the world outside of the is outside of the G7, and they reject unilateral sanctions, regime change wars, and the IMF World Bank model. Particularly in Africa, we've seen that. Many of you might have followed. Last year, there was big mobilizations in Kenya, where young people are connecting the dots that the reason for the economic crisis domestically is largely tied to the IMF World Bank model that seems to fail almost systematically and frequently. So it's precisely because of the West losing hegemony in production and not being able to, command consent through economic and political terms that it turns to military domination. In the African continent, far from being a periphery, which is, even in the case of the Second World War, Africa was a clear frontier for struggle and a frontier for domination. And today that is still very much the same case. Africa has been treated as a frontier to contain and manage and extract from. Since 2001, the US military increased its kind of permanent bases from 2 to 34. The US Africa Command conducts over 10 daily missions on African soil. And as you all know, NATO countries now account for almost 60% of global military spending. a scale designed to enforce global hierarchy, not to protect human security, which in the Sahel in North Africa, it's always about the question of fighting counterterrorism that we see hasn't improved the situation since NATO bombed Libya in 2011 and basically opened up a new space for illegal arms trades, movement of jihadist extremist violent groups, and didn't actually improve the situation in the last 10 years. When we saw France coming with the G5 Sahel, we didn't see an increase in security. In fact, it was the opposite, where instability and insecurity increased. And Britain is an active participant, as many of you know, although it has, of course, a more low-key and low footprint. But in Kenya, for example, there's 2 installations in the Batuk base, which remains despite the fact that I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, there'd been many civilian deaths from unexploded ordnance. And UK forces often operate alongside US missions in Somalia, Nigeria, even in the Sahel. Prior to the popular uprisings in the last 2 years in Niger, the British personnel were linked to operations that used the US's massive drone base in Agadez in Niger. And this is the military arm of hyper-imperialism. It coincides with economic looting. In the case of Niger and France, Niger's uranium powered 1/3 of every French light bulb for decades prior to Niger staging a popular military coup. And what we've also seen that I think is often not presented in Western media, let alone in kind of the continental media, is that actually where military presence has receded, violence has receded. After Mali had expelled French troops in 2022, terror attacks dropped by 30%. And after Niger moved to end foreign military agreements with the US and France, civilian attacks in Tillaberi and Tahoe, one of the regions that was plagued by this, actually declined. So military occupation and particularly from foreign-led military initiatives, have never been about security, but about maintaining a Western authority where its economic power had collapsed. And a lot of this is deepening ongoing crises in terms of the climate. Even though Africa emits 3.8% of global emissions, we suffer from almost 50%, or around 43% of climate-related deaths. And actually, a lot of the areas in which we see the most extremist activities in terms of violence are areas that are dealing with desertification, with a lack of food sovereignty and food security. And so when we think of security, for us in Africa, we're trying to think about social security as the answer to a lot of the problems that are often given military and weaponized forms of solutions. And just to end, I want to end with one of the areas in which we're seeing like new fault lines where popular sovereignty is being fought for and being championed. And I'm hoping that many of you have been following the Alliance of Sahel States, which is a confederation that was formed 2 years back by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And initially, Mali and Burkina Faso had military coups in 2020 and 2022, where we saw a younger legion of what some people have called captain coups, where it's people who are closer to the front line, who have worked on the front lines against jihadist violence, but also in terms of their class interest, are strongly tied to nomadic communities, cattle farming communities, to grassroots communities in a way that other kind of general coups and lieutenant coups in previous historical moments haven't been. And so I'm hoping that, I'm skimming through this a bit, hoping that you guys are aware of it, but in 2023, when Niger had a coup, importantly for y'all to know is that basically these military leaders in Niger were dissatisfied by their working conditions and the fact that the security question was not improving. And they basically took over the palace, ousted the president at the time. But importantly, the grassroots organizations saw this as an opening to put forward a popular agenda. And so it was actually the grassroots organizations like M62 that brought together student unions, women's groups, trade unions, and different Pan-African organizations in mass demonstration against French military intervention, the French foreign bases, and they're the ones who surrounded the French embassy and the French military bases and called for the expulsion of both the French and the US foreign military bases. So I share this just to say that as we're seeing these fissures and these openings, importantly is that there are grassroots organizations that are trying to lead the agenda. And a lot of those organizations come from left traditions that are thinking about anti-imperialism. So the Alliance of Sahel States is by no means a kind of, super advanced or progressive or homogenous organization, but the fact that they came together and left ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West Africa, they rejected the kind of neoliberal rules and impositions of sanctions that were coming from the West African community. They actually came together initially because the president of Nigeria, which is on the border with Niger, was threatening a military intervention. And Burkina Faso and Mali said, if you guys intervene militarily, we will fight back. And so now they've expelled the French and US military forces. They've formed a joint defense force. They've nationalized strategic mineral assets, or are in the process of doing so, to coordinate their kind of economic development and political trajectory. And they're building things like aspiring towards food sovereignty in a region that has a lot of food insecurity, where they've built regional grain reserves, where they're trying to pursue a common passport, common telecommunications. And it's important, and I share this, and I know maybe it doesn't seem exactly related to peace activism, but if we want peace, we need to deal with the issues of social security. And in order to develop, we need to have states that are coming together to coordinate for a sovereign development plan that actually deals with the dependency that we historically inherited from the colonial period. And so I think that in this moment, we are seeing some openings, but as many of you, especially those coming from left traditions, know, we enter into history in conditions not of our own making. And so we need to figure out how do we push the agenda in the interest of serving the people's needs and serving the people's interests. And so we have people on the ground in West Africa who believe this is a hopeful moment, particularly because the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States right now they know that their sustainability and their survival depends on if they meet the needs of the people. And I was lucky enough to be in Niger last year for a conference basically with people of the Sahel, coming from all over the Sahel, not just Niger and Burkina Faso and Mali. And most of the speakers were extremely enthusiastic about this as a form of reclaiming our sovereignty in a moment in which we're seeing an international crisis of capitalism. But also that they said that our support for these regimes is conditional on their ability to advance a popular sovereignty based on popular needs. And
Mikaela, I'm going to have to ask you to sum up in a minute. Okay.
I'll summarize now, but basically in the face of the military push that we are witnessing, these kinds of experiments in popular sovereignty, not military domination, are seen as hopeful. If you ask any African on the continent, like, what is the most important process that's unfolding, they'll point to the Sahel. And it's because despite the lack of, or they're not homogenous, they're not necessarily walking at the same pace, but they are aspiring for an anti-imperialist regional project that we haven't seen since the national liberation period. So I hope you'll follow the process, and I think that these are some experiments that we need to follow closely and continue to support and craft a stronger narrative about how this is not just a coup for factionalist opportunists, but it's about a coup to reclaim the sovereignty of the people's destiny.
Thank you, Mikaela.